There are pains that are not noisy, do not break into sound, but exist silently like a crack stretching through the years, and Steven Seagal has lived with that crack for more than half a century, between two lives that never really touch each other, one life where he was forced to control every glance, every movement, every word, where weakness has no place to exist, and emotions must be locked behind a cold shell, and another life where isolation does not come from having no one around, but from no one truly understanding who he is, where relationships gradually drift away, not because of lack of attachment, but because of the increasing distance between the image and the real person. He learned to stay silent instead of explaining, learned to move forward instead of turning back, and learned to exist in the world he created himself, even though that world sometimes becomes too narrow to breathe. His will is not something explosive, but something that smolders, lasts, a determination that needs no witnesses, a resolve that does not allow himself to collapse, even when he no longer knows what he is fighting for, and that silence has kept him standing firm, even though the price to pay is losing the feeling of belonging to somewhere, or to someone, even himself. However, on the other side of that silence, the world witnessed a completely different journey, where Steven Seagal became one of the most prominent action icons at the end of the 20th century, starting with Above the Law in 1988, followed by Hard to Kill, Marked for Death, and especially Under Siege in 1992, the film that elevated him to Hollywood's A-list stars. He was not only an actor, but also contributed to shaping realistic fighting styles on screen, with a high-level black belt Aikido foundation, and becoming the first foreigner to run a dojo in Osaka, Japan. His career spanned many decades with dozens of films, box office revenues of hundreds of millions of dollars, along with widespread influence in the action film genre. Outside of cinema, he also released blues music albums, participated in law enforcement activities in an honorary role, and contributed to many charitable programs, showing a person who not only exists in the spotlight, but also left marks in many other fields. Those achievements are not only the result of talent, but evidence of a persistent will, a person who has gone very far, even when inside himself there always exist two lives that have never truly merged into one. Before we continue into the story behind that person, please hit subscribe and leave a like as a quiet way to acknowledge the journey of a person who has lived too long in two lives that do not belong to each other. After everything the world has seen in Steven Seagal, few know that that journey did not begin with punches or stage lights, but began from a childhood that was not noisy, not chaotic, but lacked the most important thing: deep connection between person and person. He grew up in a family that was not poor to the point of desperation, not violently broken, without clear tragedies for others to easily recognize, but that very normalcy hid a nameless void, a feeling of alienation that crept through every day, every meal, every conversation where it seemed no one truly listened to the end. In the house where everything still happened in the right order, where life lacked no material things, there still existed an invisible silence, not peace but the absence of connection, where a child learned to observe more than to express, learned to understand others without expecting others to understand him back. Steven was not a noisy child, not someone who always sought attention. He chose to stand back a little, listen more than speak, and gradually that very step back became a real distance between him and the world around. While other children found safety in family or friendship, he began to get used to handling emotions by himself, facing questions with no answers by himself, learning by himself not to need anyone to confirm what he was feeling. There were evenings that passed in silence, without conflict, without tears, but also without sharing, and it was precisely those voids that shaped who he became. More than any event, he was not forced to be silent, but gradually realized that silence made everything simpler, less complicated, less hurtful, and over time that silence was no longer a reaction, but became instinct. In class, he was not the center, nor was he completely abandoned, but always had the feeling of standing in a position where no one truly saw him, as if he was there but did not really belong there. Conversations happened around him but rarely touched him, and when he began to speak, he was not sure if anyone was really listening. Gradually, a quiet belief formed that being understood was not necessary to exist, that a person could continue living without anyone entering their inner world. It was not strength but a form of adaptation, a way to avoid the feeling of disappointment when expecting something from others. As he grew up, he withdrew more, not out of fear but because he no longer saw reason to open up, and that very withdrawal created a person who was hard to grasp, hard to approach, and ultimately hard to understand. The saddest thing was not that he had no one by his side, but that he gradually got used to it, got used to not needing anyone by his side, got used to carrying everything by himself, without sharing, got used to living in a world where emotions were kept inside rather than spoken out. And when a child grows up in such a state, he does not learn to seek connection, but learns to exist without it. Not because he does not want to be understood, but because he has become too used to not being understood. It was from those years that the two lives began to form, not clearly, not separated immediately, but enough to create a faint boundary between the person the world would see later and the person he kept for himself. A boundary that as time went on he could no longer erase, no matter how hard he tried. Then one day, the silence was no longer just a way to exist, but became something that urged him to leave, as if staying longer would trap him forever in that very void. And Steven Seagal chose to leave the United States when he was still very young, not because he had a clear plan, but because he no longer felt he belonged there. That decision was not noisy, had no grand farewells, just a quiet step, carrying a familiar feeling, the feeling of not belonging anywhere. Only this time he actively went to find another place to try again. Japan welcomed him not with warmth, but with cold strangeness, a closed world where everything had its own rules, where language was a wall and culture was a door not easy to open. He did not know how to speak, had no friends, had no one to lead the way, and had no real anchor anywhere. All he had was himself and the silence that had followed him since childhood. The first days passed so slowly, it felt like time stood still. Every look from those around reminded him that he was an outsider, did not belong here, was not understood, and perhaps did not need to be understood. He walked through crowded streets but still felt like he was walking alone, sat in small rooms where the noise outside could not reach inside. And gradually loneliness was no longer a fleeting feeling, but became a state of living, something present in every moment, from waking up until closing his eyes. There were days he did not talk to anyone, not because he did not want to, but because he did not know where to start, and was not sure if anyone really wanted to listen. The silence in Japan was different from the silence he had known. It was deeper, colder, and did not allow him to escape. With no family, no familiar environment, nothing to rely on, he was forced to confront himself completely, without hiding, without avoiding. And it was in that emptiness that a question began to emerge more clearly than ever. If he could not control the world around him, could he learn to control himself? It was not a philosophical thought, but a survival need, because when everything outside could not be grasped, the only thing left was himself. He began to seek something that could bring structure, discipline, something strong enough to replace everything he had never had: stability, clarity, a feeling of belonging, even if only within a certain framework. And then he found martial arts, not as a random choice, but as a natural response to the chaos inside. The first training sessions were not easy at all. The body ached, breathing was disrupted, every movement was unfamiliar, but there was one thing he realized very quickly. In that space, everything had rules, every action had a cause, and every mistake could be corrected. For the first time in his life, he felt there was a system he could understand, a world he could gradually control. But that path did not come with immediate recognition. He was still an outsider, still looked at with skepticism, still had to prove himself more than anyone else. And there were times when loneliness seemed to return even stronger. But this time, he did not leave, did not turn away, did not try to escape, because he had begun to realize that staying, enduring, and continuing was the only way to build something lasting. As days passed, silence was no longer just a void, but became a foundation, where he laid each brick of a new person, a person built not from others' understanding, but from his own discipline and control. And though the world around him still did not change, still remained strange, still did not belong to him, for the first time he began to feel that perhaps as long as he could control himself, he could create a place to exist, even if that place only existed inside himself. And from that moment, martial arts was no longer a choice, but became the only place where Steven Seagal could exist without feeling lost. A place that did not require him to explain who he was, did not demand he be accepted through words, only that he show up, endure, and continue. The training days began to follow one another like an endless loop. Early mornings when the city had not yet woken up, he was already on the training floor, and when night fell, when others had left, he still stayed, repeating the same movement, the same fall, the same technique, to the point his body could no longer distinguish pain from mistakes or from excessive repetition. There were days when his hands trembled from exhaustion, His joints ached as if protesting, but he did not stop, because stopping meant returning to the void he had left behind. In that space, pain was not something to avoid, but something to accept, even to seek, because each time he fell and stood up, he felt he was controlling something, even if only very small. His body began to adapt before his mind could realize. Movements became more precise, reflexes faster, and gradually what was once forced became natural. But the biggest change was not in technique, but inside. Where chaos once existed began to settle, not because it disappeared, but because it was replaced by something else. Discipline. Every breath, every step, every movement had rules, and in those rules he found the stability he had never had before. Emotions no longer drove actions, but actions began to shape emotions, and when that happened, he gradually learned not to react, not to let himself be swept by what happened outside. Silence now was no longer a void, but a state of control, a shell built with purpose. Those around him began to notice the change, not through praise or clear recognition, but by the way they looked at him, the way they treated him, as if he was no longer a complete stranger, but had never truly become part of them, and it was in that in-between state that he continued deeper into the path he had chosen, not to be accepted, but to not have to return to the old self. Time passed. He no longer counted days, no longer thought about how long was enough, because there was no clear endpoint, only continuation, a prolonged process where each day was the same, but not entirely the same. His body became stronger, but also harder, less flexible in some way, as if each added layer of discipline also took away some inner softness. His mind became more stable, but also more closed off, less fluctuating, but also less feeling. He was no longer swept by emotions, but also no longer allowed himself to truly touch them. And from there, a new person gradually formed, a cold, controlled person, unshaken by pressure, unreactive to change, a person who could stand firm in any circumstance, but also no longer easily connected with anyone. The strength he built did not come from defeating others, but from not letting himself be shaken. And that very thing made him different, not only in the dojo, but in the way he viewed the world. But the price of that difference was not paid immediately. It accumulated over time, silently, unclearly, until he began to realize that the more he controlled himself, the further he drifted from the person he once was, and perhaps from the person he could have become. Memories of a child who once waited to be listened to, once wanted to be understood, did not disappear, but were pushed into a corner he rarely looked at. Instead was a version that needed no one to understand, needed no one to stay, needed no confirmation from outside. And though that helped him stand firm, helped him exist in a world he once did not belong to, it also made him gradually accustomed to not needing to return, not needing to find again, not needing to confront the part of himself left behind. And so in the process of building a person strong enough not to be broken, he also unintentionally created an ever-growing distance between two parts of himself, one part trained, controlled, and existing with absolute discipline, and another part still there, silent, not gone, but no longer touched. And then, when that new person gradually became more solid, when discipline had replaced chaos, when every movement of body and mind was under control, Steven Seagal began to step into a phase that seemed like a reward for all those years of endurance, a life with family, with stability, with things he had never had before. He got married, had children, and for the first time in many years had a space that could be called home, where there were not only walls and furniture, but the presence of people connected by affection. There were quiet, warm mornings when light filtered through the windows, and there was nothing to fight, nothing to control, just the simple presence of loved ones nearby. There were moments when, if viewed from outside, people might believe he had found what he once lacked, a place to stop, a place to belong. But beneath all that, a familiar feeling began to return, not noisy, not clear, but enough to keep him from being completely at peace. It was not dissatisfaction with what he had, nor lack of affection, but a deep-seated unease, as if some part of him never truly believed he could keep these things for long. He was there but not fully present. He listened, but did not truly open up. He loved, but in a way others could hardly reach. The distance did not appear immediately, but grew gradually over time, little by little, in unfinished conversations, in silences that lasted longer than usual, in glances where connection was no longer found as before. Those around him could sense it, but could not name it, could not understand why a person who had everything needed to be happy still seemed to stand at a distance that could not be crossed, and he himself could not explain it, because it did not come from a specific reason, but from a way of existing formed long before. He had grown used to carrying everything himself, used to not depending on anyone, used to keeping everything inside, and when stepping into a relationship that required sharing, presence, deep connection, he realized he did not know how to stay fully, not because he did not want to, but because he had never learned how. Each day that passed, the silence between him and his family was no longer peace, but became distance, a distance no one deliberately created, but no one knew how to narrow. Efforts to get closer may have happened, but always stopped before an invisible boundary he could not cross, and then at some point, the decision to leave was no longer a sudden act, but the result of a prolonged process, where staying became harder than leaving. He did not leave because he stopped loving, did not leave because he wanted to destroy what he had built, but left because he did not know how to continue there without losing himself, or at least the version of himself he had grown familiar with. It was a choice full of contradictions, a step that did not bring complete liberation but only transformed the form of pain, from not belonging anywhere to leaving a place where he might have belonged. Behind him was a family still there, with memories, moments, things not yet fully said, and a sense of loss not easy to name. And ahead, he continued to walk, carrying a new crack, deeper, clearer, but still not enough to make him stop, because if there was one thing he had learned very early, it was to continue, even when unsure where he was going, and to accept that there are things in life that cannot be returned to, cannot be fixed, can only exist as part of who he is, silently, but never disappearing. A light what he could not keep. Steven Seagal returned to the United States not as a person starting over from the beginning, but as a person who had carried too many things inside, but had nowhere to put them down. He stepped into Hollywood, not with naive dreams, but with something that had been forged over many years: discipline, control, and a silence that made others both curious and wary. The door opened not by pure luck, but by his very difference, a fighting style unlike anyone else's, a way of presence on screen that did not need to show off but was still enough to make people notice. And then everything happened faster than anything he had ever experienced, so fast that he had no time to understand where he stood. From the first roles he was seen, no longer the person standing at the edge of a room, no longer the person being passed over as if he did not exist, but the center of attention, where every movement was recorded, every eye turned toward him. For the first time in his life he did not need to try to be noticed, and that very thing created a feeling both familiar and strange, familiar with existing in silence, but strange with being seen so clearly. The recognition came not only from audiences, but from an entire system that had once been alien to him, and when it came it did not wait for him to be ready. Roles followed one after another, bigger projects, non-stop invitations, and in all of that a new person began to form in front of the public eye, a man who never stepped back, never wavered, never showed any sign of weakness. The irony was that this person was not entirely a role, but not entirely himself either, but a combination of what he had learned and what the world wanted to see, and because he had grown used to controlling himself, he did not resist that image, did not try to change it, but gradually accepted it as part of himself. But fame arrived before he had the chance to fully understand who his real self was, before he could reconcile the different parts inside him, and therefore, instead of connecting the two lives together, it pushed them even further apart. One life existed on screen, where everything was clear, where strength always won, where there was no room for contradiction, and another life where the voids were still there, where questions had never been answered, where the real person still existed in silence. The more famous he became, the larger that gap grew, because the image the public saw became too strong, too complete, leaving no room for anything else. He was no longer just a man, but became a symbol, a template that others expected. And when a person is seen as a symbol, they are no longer allowed to be human in the normal way. What he had once hidden inside now did not disappear, but was only pushed deeper, covered by the light of fame, overwhelmed by applause and recognition. And while the world believed they knew who he was, he increasingly realized there was a part of him that no one had ever seen, no one had ever touched. From then on, the two lives no longer existed in parallel, but began to separate completely, no longer intersecting, no longer influencing each other in a natural way. One part continued to grow, to strengthen, nourished by the public's gaze, while the other receded, silent, but not gone. And in that separation, One thing gradually became clear, that the further he went on the path of success, the harder it was to turn back to understand his real self, because the world did not wait for him to do that, and he himself no longer knew where to begin. And when those two lives had completely separated, what remained was not balance, but an image that began to grow beyond the person who had created it. When Steven Seagal was no longer just an actor, but became a symbol of invincibility, a template that each subsequent role had to repeat, reinforce, and make even stronger. From above the law to hard to kill, from marked for death to under siege, his characters always entered the story with absolute control, without panic, without doubt, without any sign of weakness, as if failure did not exist in his world. Audiences did not just watch him act, they believed in him, believed that man was real, that in real life he was also someone who could stand firm against everything without needing anyone's help. And that very belief, instead of being a gift, became an invisible pressure, because when an image is loved too much, it is no longer a choice but becomes an obligation. Each new role was not an opportunity to change, but a requirement to stay the same, to continue being the unbreakable, undefeatable man who could not be seen in any other state, and in that process the space for him to experiment, to fail, to show other parts of himself gradually disappeared. Everything became frighteningly clear. Either continue maintaining that image, or lose everything he had built. And when the choice was presented that way, it was no longer a choice. He entered each project with the same rhythm, the same way of moving, the same gaze, as if recreating himself over and over again, not because he could not do otherwise, but because he was not allowed to do otherwise. The public loved that image. They came to him to see the familiar feeling again, to be assured that the man they trusted was still there, still unchanged, still unaffected by anything. But what they did not see was the real person standing behind, who had to shrink, to step back, to stay silent, to make room for a bigger, stronger, more perfect version. And when a person lives too long in such a repeatedly reinforced image, the boundary between acting and self begins to blur. Not suddenly but slowly through each role, each praise, each confirming glance. There were moments when he might have wondered if he was really the person the world was seeing. But those moments were quickly overwhelmed by the pace of work, by expectations that did not allow stopping. Gradually the question was no longer asked, not because there was an answer, but because there was no longer space to ask. The real person and the public image did not merge into one, but overlapped, weighed on each other, until separating them became nearly impossible. And in that state the mask was no longer something put on when needed, but became part of the face, a part that could not be removed without hurting himself. The scariest thing was not being misunderstood, but gradually no longer being able to distinguish what was real, what was acting, what was natural reflex, and what had been programmed over many years. He no longer needed to try to maintain that image, because it had become instinct, an automatic way of existing, where every reaction followed a pre-shaped pattern. And it was precisely then, when everything looked the most perfect, the most stable, the most unbreakable, that the distance between the two lives reached its farthest point, when one side had become too strong to be changed and the other too silent to return. A perfect mask is not a mask without cracks, but a mask that no one remembers was ever a mask. And when that happens, removing it is no longer a choice, but something nearly impossible, because behind it is not only the real person, but everything that had been left behind for many years unseen. And when the mask had become the face, when that unbreakable image was reinforced through each role, each success, then something else also quietly grew at the same time. Power. Not the noisy kind of power, but power large enough to shape everything around it, to make Steven Seagal no longer just a part of the film, but the control center of it. He was no longer simply the one performing the role, but began to participate in how the story was told, how the character was built, how each scene was arranged, each movement decided, with the deeply ingrained foundation of discipline, with the habit of not letting anything slip out of control. He gradually brought that way of living into his work, not as a choice but as a natural reflex. At first, that created results. The films maintained consistency, the image was preserved, audiences got exactly what they expected, and success continued to repeat. But control, when without limits, does not stop at keeping everything stable. It begins to spread, touching parts that previously did not belong to him. The director's decisions, the creative space of co-stars, the natural rhythm of a collective. People who had once collaborated began to feel the change. Not immediately, but through small details, exchanges became more difficult. Opinions were no longer received as before. Differences were no longer reconciled but pushed aside. Conflicts did not erupt into clear confrontations, but accumulated, smoldered, like an ever-increasing pressure that no one really wanted to name. Some people chose to stay, to adapt, to accept the new framework, but others began to step back, not because they did not respect him, but because they no longer found a place for themselves in a space where everything had already been predetermined. And it was in that process that a familiar thing repeated itself. Distance, no longer the distance of a child in a family, no longer the distance of a stranger in a foreign country, but the distance between him and those who once stood beside him in the same work. The more he tried to keep everything under control, the more he unintentionally pushed others away, not because he wanted to, but because the way he existed did not allow the flexibility that relationships need. Step by step, without noise, without suddenness, connections began to thin, conversations became shorter, glances became more cautious, and then some people were no longer there. The sad thing was that in all those changes, he did not always realize it immediately, because from his perspective, everything was still running, projects were still completed, the image was still maintained, results were still achieved. But there are things that cannot be measured by results, things that only appear when looking back, when realizing that around him there were no longer familiar faces, no longer the relationships that once created a sense of companionship. Control had helped him build a stable world, but it also turned that world into an increasingly closed space, where everything was as he wanted but lacked the vitality of the unpredictable. And when a person lives too long in such a space, they no longer have to face external chaos, but also gradually lose the ability to connect with it. Isolation did not come as a shock, but as a process, layer by layer until it became the normal state, and in that state he continued to work, continued to maintain the image, continued to control everything as he had always done, but at the same time also continued to move further away from what had once been his real self, because control could keep everything from collapsing, but it could not keep everything in place. And when those around him began to leave, what remained was not only the familiar silence, but a new void, deeper, clearer, created not by circumstances, but by the very way he had chosen to exist. And in that void, a paradox began to emerge, that the very thing that had helped him stand firm, that had brought him to the position the whole world saw, was also the thing gradually pushing him away from that world, step by step, irreversibly. And when isolation gradually became a familiar state, when the voids no longer shocked but simply existed silently as an inevitable part, Steven Seagal's life began to enter a phase where everything seemed to still be running, but in reality was gradually slipping out of his hands. Personal relationships, once rare anchors in a life that lacked connection, began to crack in a way that was not noisy, without a single moment that could be named as the end, but a series of small distances accumulating over time. People who had once been close, who had once understood him to some degree, gradually became strangers, not because they changed completely, but because he no longer stood in a place they could reach. Conversations became shorter, less meaningful, and then gradually disappeared, as if they had never existed. Family, which should have been a place to return to, could no longer hold that role, not because it did not exist, but because he no longer knew how to step back into it, no longer knew who to be when standing in that space. Not the image on screen, nor completely the person they had once known. The distance came not only from geographical distance or time, but from the fact that both sides no longer shared the same world, the same way of seeing, the same rhythm of life. And when that happened, returning was no longer a simple choice, but became something nearly impossible. Parallel with those cracks, controversies began to appear, not all of them clear, not all of them proven, but enough to create a new layer of pressure, a layer he could not fully control in the way he controlled his work. Accusations, stories told from many sides, different perspectives on who he was began to spread, and for the first time in many years, the solid image he had built had to face doubt. But instead of collapsing immediately, that image still stood firm on the surface, still continued to exist in the public eye as an unshakable symbol, as if nothing had changed. It was that very contrast between external stability and internal cracks that created a pressure not easy to see, but growing larger. He continued to appear, continued to work, continued to maintain the familiar rhythm, but inside, what had once been held tight began to slip out of his hands, not in a sudden way, but little by little, like sand flowing through his fingers that could not be kept. The more he tried to control, the more he tried to keep everything in place, the more he realized that there were things that could not be kept by discipline or will, especially people, especially emotions. Relationships could not exist by one-sided presence alone, and when one side could not open up, the other could not continue waiting forever. The pain did not lie in the loss, but in realizing that he had not known how to keep them, that what left did not leave because it was weak, but because the way he existed did not allow it to stay, and in all of that he was not someone who completely failed to notice, but he was also not someone who could easily change, because what had been built in him, discipline, control, closedness, were not things that could be removed overnight. They had become the way he understood the world, the way he protected himself, and also the way he unintentionally created distance with others. Therefore, his life in this phase was not a series of clear failures, but a process of silent disintegration, where everything still seemed to be there, but no longer in its original state. A life where the more he tried to hold on, the more it slipped away, not because of lack of effort, but because what needed to be kept could not be kept by the way he had grown used to using. And when looking back, what remained was not the question of who was right or wrong, but a hard-to-accept truth, that there are things, once they have drifted away, that will not return, and there are distances once formed that can never be completely filled, no matter how far one continues to walk. And then there came a time when what had once been held tight had gradually left his hands, when relationships no longer stayed to wait for him. Another change began to take place, slow but irreversible. The door that Steven Seagal had once walked through with all certainty and control no longer opened as before. Hollywood, which had once welcomed him as a phenomenon, a new face with an unmistakable style, gradually became quieter, not through direct rejections, but through the absence of invitations, opportunities, calls that had once come regularly. There was no specific moment to mark that change, no big event to explain it, only a nearly imperceptible shift day by day, until he looked back and realized he no longer stood in the old position. Roles began to decrease, projects no longer carried the same scale as before, and what had once been the center of an industry gradually drifted toward the sidelines. The difficulty did not lie in losing opportunities, but in facing the change in the way the world looked at him. When eyes that had once sought him with expectation no longer turned that way, he was no longer the first choice, no longer the name people immediately thought of when needing a specific icon, and in a world that operated by attention, no longer being noticed was a very different kind of silence, a kind of silence that could not be filled by effort or discipline. From the center, he gradually became part of the background, a part that still existed but no longer shaped the story, and that shift did not only happen outside, but touched the way he perceived himself. For the first time in many years, he had to face a question that had not really appeared before. If there was no longer light, if there was no longer recognition, then what remained of him? Before, the light was not only where he stood, but also what covered the cracks inside, the voids he did not need to face while busy maintaining the image. But when the light faded, no longer strong enough to cover, what had once been kept behind began to emerge more clearly, not like a shock, but like a truth that had always been there. With no longer the dense pace of work, no longer the pressure to maintain the image every day, the void returned, and this time it was no longer something new but something he had known from very long ago, from the early years when silence was the only way to exist. That silence now returned, not because he was completely abandoned, but because the world around him was no longer as noisy as before, no longer had enough sound to fill what was inside. There were mornings that passed more slowly, days without a clear schedule, periods when he did not need to be anyone except himself, and it was in those periods that the silence became clearer than ever. The difficulty did not lie in losing position, but in having to live in a state no longer defined by what he had grown used to, when there were no more roles to step into, no image to maintain, no gazes to reflect back the person he thought he was, and in that state he did not collapse, did not react in a way others could easily notice, because he had grown used to standing firm in silence, used to continuing even when nothing was certain ahead, but that continuation carried a different feeling, no longer advancing, but holding himself from falling, not conquering but existing. And when looking back, perhaps he realized that this silence was not completely unfamiliar. It was only another version of what he had once experienced, only different in that this time it came after everything he had built, not before he began. And in that return one thing became clear, that no matter how the world changed, no matter how the light faded, what lay inside him was still there, not gone, not replaced, only waiting for a quiet enough moment to be seen, and it was in that moment that his story was no longer about keeping or losing, but about facing, not the world but himself, in a space where there was nothing left to hide. And when the light had receded far enough that it no longer covered, another truth began to appear more clearly than anything before, not in the eyes of others, but in Steven Seagal's own perception of himself, when the body, the most solid foundation for every image he had built, began to change in an undeniable way. Movements that had once been natural reflexes, once performed with near-perfect precision, now no longer came as easily as before. Every step became heavier, every turn no longer retained the flexibility it once had, and what was notable was not that the change happened suddenly, but that it came gradually, slow enough to be overlooked for a long time, but clear enough that it could no longer be ignored. The body that had once been a perfect control tool now began to have its own limits, limits that Will could not overcome, no matter how hard he tried. He had grown used to the idea that if he repeated enough, if discipline was tight enough, if focus was deep enough, everything could be improved, controlled, adjusted, but this time that rule no longer worked the way he had trusted. There were training sessions that no longer brought a sense of progress, movements that no longer responded as before, and for the first time in many years, he had to face the fact that his body no longer completely belonged to him. The invincible image he had carried for decades, though it still existed on screen, began to lose its compatibility with reality, not because it was wrong, but because it no longer accurately reflected who he was in the present. That did not happen clearly in front of the public, but in private moments, in attempts to repeat a familiar technique, in realizations that he needed more time to recover. That truth gradually became unavoidable. For a person who had built his entire life on the ability to control, losing part of that control was not only a physical change, but a deeper shock, touching the way he understood himself. He did not react with panic, did not show collapse, because that was not how he existed, but the change was still there, silent but constant, forcing him to adjust, not in the proactive way as before, but in the way of adapting to what could not be changed. There were days he realized that completing a movement was no longer something obvious, but the result of greater effort than before, and in those moments, the question was no longer how to be stronger, but how to continue. Facing limits was not a single event, but a process, where each day brought a small awareness of what had changed, and each awareness required a corresponding acceptance. The difficulty did not lie in the body weakening, but in accepting that there were parts of himself that were no longer as before, that the invincibility once believed in was not a permanent state, but only a phase, and for him, someone who had grown used to standing firm against everything, that acceptance was not a simple act, but a profound adjustment in the way he viewed strength, no longer about never being affected, but about continuing even when affected, no longer about absolute control, but about finding a way to live within new limits. The shock did not come from one specific moment, but from realizing that the past could not be repeated, that what had once defined him could no longer be recreated in the old way. And in that realization, there was another silence, not the silence of lacking connection, but the silence of acceptance, where he no longer tried to deny what was happening, but began to look straight at it, not to change it, but to understand, because after all, when the body no longer obeyed as before, when the image no longer matched reality, what remained was not about holding on to what had been lost, but about finding a way to exist with what was left, in a new state he had never experienced, but also could not avoid. And when the body no longer obeyed as before, when the new limits forced him to look back at the way he existed, another choice gradually formed, not like an impulsive reaction, but like a direction considered in silence. When Steven Seagal began to move away from the center of Hollywood, not with a clear statement, but with slow steps backward from a world where he had once stood at the center, the doors no longer opened as before, the invitations no longer carried the same weight, and instead of trying to return to the old position, he chose a different path, a path not directed toward the familiar light, but outward, where few understood, few accepted. In that journey, his connection with Vladimir Putin and Russia gradually became clearer, not like a media strategy, but like a bond that he felt suited him at a time when everything else was changing. He participated in cultural diplomatic activities, received Russian citizenship, appeared in contexts that few could have imagined him stepping into before. For a portion of the public, it was a difficult to understand step, even controversial, as his image was no longer tied to Hollywood, but shifted to a completely different space. Criticisms began to appear more frequently, not only about career choices but also about viewpoints, positions, and the meaning of those decisions. There were people who had once followed him who turned away, not because they no longer remembered what he had done, but because they no longer recognized the person they once knew. The misunderstanding did not come from only one side, but from the ever-growing gap between the way he saw the world and the way the world saw him. But what was notable was that in all those reactions, he did not change his direction, did not try to explain noisily, did not try to adjust to fit expectations better. He continued, not because that path was easy, but because it was the path he had chosen. In a phase where choosing mattered more than being accepted, the isolation that had existed before now became clearer, not only in his personal life, but in the way he was perceived globally. But unlike previous phases, this isolation was not entirely an unintended consequence, but part of a choice, part of standing firm in a direction not understood by the majority. Perhaps he realized that trying to return to an old position no longer fit, that continuing to follow an image that no longer accurately reflected who he was could not be sustained long-term, and therefore instead of trying to fix what had changed, he chose to build a different reality. Even if that reality did not bring broad consensus, his steadfastness was not rigidity, but the result of a long process in which he had learned not to depend on recognition to continue. The criticisms, the misunderstandings, the looks that no longer resembled before, all became part of the context he accepted, not to fight against, but to exist in it in his own way. And in that choice there was a clear paradox, that the further he moved away from the familiar, the more consistent he became with himself, that the more he was misunderstood, the less he was bound by the images others assigned to him. The path he chose did not bring ease, did not bring consensus, but brought a different kind of stability, a kind of stability not based on position or fame, but on not needing to turn back to prove anything. And in that context, his story was no longer about regaining what had been lost, but about continuing with what he had chosen, even if that choice left him standing alone more than ever, but also clearer than ever about the path he was on. And when the path was no longer measured by recognition or the understanding of others, when the choices had taken him far from the center where he had once stood, Steven Seagal began to step into a different state of existence, not an ending, but an acceptance of something that had always existed for a very long time, two people living in the same life, but never truly meeting. One person the world had seen, remembered, and defined, the man on screen, invincible, controlled, unwavering, existing as a symbol of strength that needed no explanation, and another person, never fully seen, not in the spotlight, not in the public template, a person formed from silences, private choices, moments without an audience, where no role was played, no image was maintained. For many years, those two parts did not exist separately in a clear way, but intertwined, overlapped, stretched each other, creating a state that even he himself could not easily name. There were times he lived as if he were the image the world expected, and there were times he withdrew to a place no one could reach, where there was no expectation, no gaze, no requirement to become anyone else. But over time, the effort to harmonize those two parts gradually disappeared, not because he found a way to resolve it, but because he realized there were contradictions that could not be solved by trying to make them the same. And when the contradiction was no longer seen as a problem to fix, it became part of existence. He no longer asked which was real, which was fake, which was acting, which was the person, because that question gradually lost its meaning when both parts had lived too long in the same body. Instead, he began to observe them as two parallel flows, not needing to merge, not needing to eliminate, only needing to coexist. There was a part of him that continued to move in the outside world, where the image, memories, and symbol were maintained, where people still looked at him the way they had always looked. And there was another part, quieter, no longer trying to compete for position, no longer trying to be understood, simply existing in its absolute privacy. What had once caused inner conflict for many years was now no longer seen as a crack to mend, but as a state that had become the default, something that needed no further explanation. He no longer spent energy trying to make those two parts unified, because unity was no longer the goal. Instead, he began to live with the awareness that a person does not necessarily have to be only one single version to exist. In that acceptance, a different kind of quiet appeared, not the quiet of perfection, but the quiet of no longer having to fight against himself. The two lives continued to exist, but no longer confronted each other, no longer tried to eliminate each other, but like two parallel lines running side by side, not meeting, but moving forward together in the same space. And it was in that state that his story was no longer about becoming one single someone, but about continuing to live with everything he had become, even if it was never completely whole in the eyes of anyone, including himself. And when the two lives had coexisted long enough that they no longer caused clear conflict, when living with two selves became the normal state instead of a problem to solve, something else appeared more distinctly than ever, the silence that had stretched through decades inside Steven Seagal, a silence not because there was nothing to say, but because there were too many things that had never found the right place to be spoken. Throughout his life, he had been seen by millions of people, defined by hundreds of roles, mentioned in countless stories about strength, control, and invincibility, but the more he was seen from the outside, the less the inside had a chance to be touched. There were questions that never had answers, not because they were too complex, but because no one ever stopped long enough to hear the full answer, or perhaps there was no space quiet enough for those answers to exist completely. He was not someone who did not speak, but over time he learned that not every word led to understanding, and not every explanation was received correctly, and it was from that silence began to form as a safer choice, with less risk, and eventually became habit. On the outside, his life was always noisy. Movies, images, controversies, fame, media, everything revolved around him with unrelenting intensity, as if there was always a story being written about him that he could not fully control. But inside, the contrast happened in an almost absolute way, where it was not voices but emptiness that dominated, where things never spoken accumulated through the years, not disappearing, not exploding but only settling. Day after day, there were memories, choices, moments that if placed in a different context could have become explanations, but in reality they only existed as scattered pieces that were never pieced together into a complete story. And it was that incompleteness that created a special kind of silence, not peace, but the absence of connection between what had happened and what was told. He was not someone without a story to share, but someone with too many layers of stories stacked on top of each other to the point there was no clear enough point to begin telling it completely. And when no one truly listened to the whole, continuing to speak gradually became unnecessary. Over time, the most important questions were no longer asked, not because they had answers, but because they were no longer asked. That did not happen in one moment, but was the result of decades of accumulation, where each incomplete explanation, each misunderstanding, each reduction to a single image pushed the silence deeper a little further, and in that state, the truth did not disappear, but it was also never told in full. It existed as scattered fragments, unconnected, unconfirmed, not fully shared with anyone. His life therefore became a paradox, a life full of noise on the outside, but empty on the inside, where the image was always bigger than the person, and the story always went far beyond the storyteller. Perhaps the most painful thing was not being misunderstood, but not having the opportunity to be fully understood, not because of a lack of people who cared, but because of the lack of a space where the entire truth could exist without being cut short. And in that prolonged silence, there was no single moment big enough to break it, because it was not created by one single event, but by countless small moments that were never spoken correctly, and therefore it did not need to be broken, because it had become part of the way he existed, a part inseparable from the person who had lived through two parallel lives, where the truth was always present, but never told in full, even when the whole world thought they knew everything. And when all those layers of silence, light, controversy, and memories had stacked on top of each other long enough that the beginning and the end could no longer be distinguished, the story of Steven Seagal is no longer simply the story of an action star, but becomes a journey full of contradictions of a person who has lived too long in two different versions of himself. A person the world sees as a symbol of strength, of control, of near absolute invincibility on screen, but at the same time a person carrying inside him voids that were never filled, cracks that were never mended, and pieces of memories that were never told in full. And when looking back at that entire journey, what remains is not a linear story of success or failure, but a prolonged existence between two opposing poles, where there is no real intersection, only a parallelism stretching to the end of life. He has been strong in the way the world could see but also lonely in a way very few could understand, because his strength lies not only in the roles but also in the ability to continue existing even when the connection with himself and with others becomes increasingly fragile. And in that journey, success never truly fills the inner voids, it only changes their shape, covers them with light, with fame, with recognition, but never makes them disappear. The further he goes, the clearer his two lives become. One life defined by the public, amplified by the media, portrayed by cinema, and another life that exists only in silence, in personal choices, in times without an audience, without cameras, without retelling. And the most special thing is that those two lives never merge, not because they cannot, but because they have developed in two different directions for too long to be able to return to one. That separation is not an event, but a process stretching across decades, where each success, each controversy, each change in life pushes those two parts further apart a little more, until the boundary becomes almost impossible to erase. But if we only see him as a person divided in two, that is still not enough, because in that very separation there exists a strange kind of consistency, the unchanging steadfastness in the way he exists, in the way he continues to move forward despite all the changes around him. He never truly becomes a single version that the world can easily define, and perhaps that is exactly what makes his legacy more complex than any template. Because that legacy is not only the films, not only the martial arts style, not only the image of an action star who once dominated the screen, but also the story of a person who has lived his whole life in separation, not to find a way to heal it, but to continue existing with it. A person who, the further he goes into the light, carries more darkness inside, and the more the world knows him, the less he is truly understood. And when all is looked back upon, what remains is not an answer but a lingering question, whether a person needs to become a single version to be considered whole or not, or whether the existence of irreconcilable contradictions is what truly makes up their essence. In his case, there is no final harmony, no moment of complete liberation, only continuation, continuing to live, continuing to exist, continuing to carry two parallel lives until the end of the journey. And perhaps that is the deepest legacy he leaves behind. Not perfection, not invincibility, but a story about a person who has never become just one single person, but still continues to walk forward as if that is enough. Fourthly, looking back at Steven Seagal's entire journey, what remains is not only the image of an action star who once dominated Hollywood screens, but the silent tragedy of a person who has lived too long in two lives that never merge into one. From the early days in Japan, where he turned to martial arts as a refuge to escape the feeling of alienation, to becoming the invincible icon on screen with Under Siege and Hard to Kill, he built an image the whole world admired, a man who never falls, never steps back. But that very perfection created an ever-growing distance between the real person and the public image. The details in the story, the distancing from family, broken relationships, isolation in his career, and the controversies surrounding his life, are not just individual events, but pieces of a life always stretched between control and loss of control. The more he tried to maintain the strong image, the more he lost the ability to truly connect with others and with himself. A successful career did not erase the inner void, but only covered it with the glamorous light of Hollywood. From a realistic perspective for American audiences, this story reminds us that success, fame, or power is never enough to fill loneliness if a person loses inner balance. True strength does not lie in never breaking, but in daring to face the imperfect parts of oneself. Seagal's life is a reminder that every person has multiple versions existing in parallel, but if we do not learn to reconcile with ourselves, we may live our whole lives in separation without ever realizing it. And it is precisely in that poignancy that we must still acknowledge one thing. He is not only a star but a person who tried to exist in the only way he knew, even if the price was a loneliness that lasted throughout his life. Wondersink, if the story of Steven Seagal has touched you, please hit subscribe and leave a like as a quiet way to show respect for those who have lived their entire lives in contradictions that cannot be named. Thank you for accompanying us until the end of the video, and see you again in the next story where we continue to explore the destinies behind the stage lights that few have ever truly understood.